I'm sure this has happened to you before, where you have the occasion to meet a new person, but before you actually come face to face with them, you hear certain things about them, certain parts of their reputation or certain characteristics as they are perceived by other people. Or maybe this has happened to you where someone comes up and says, "Oh, we haven't met, but your reputation precedes you." All this means is I've heard about you before we've had the occasion to come face to face. And this can be really good or really bad. If people are spreading rumors or lies or misinformation about you, this can be really hurtful and not good. And you hope that this person is going to treat you fairly and not just listen to those things, but be a little more discerning. But it can be good as well. Maybe the information is good stuff. It's good characteristics. Maybe you have a reputation of being trustworthy or very friendly. This can be really nice. But even if this information isn't good or accurate information, I think it can still be valuable in teaching us something about someone, even if it isn't the new person that we're trying to get to know. For example, if my friend comes up and says, "Oh, that guy over there, yeah, I guess he's nice enough, but he's really hard to get along with because he's such a stickler for the rules." Now, I might go up and have a totally different experience with this person. They might not seem like a stickler at all. They're just easygoing, laid back, relaxed, and I might learn something about my friend because maybe they are saying that based on their perception of rule following and obedience. They're thinking, "Man, that guy's such a stickler compared to how things should be, which is how I live." But I might realize my friend kind of plays it fast and loose with the rules. So that could teach me about my friend based on his perception of this other person. Maybe it will teach me that I just haven't come across the scenario where this person could be a stickler for the rules. And so I have more to learn about this person that I didn't come across on our first interaction. But either way, it's something to keep in the back of my mind just to figure out, why did this person have this perception or this reputation before I even met them? Why was that a characteristic that was so unique to them that it felt like it was needed to be told to me? Was it just gossip, or is there something to this information? And I think for this reason, even if the information isn't my perception as I meet them, it can still be worth something. This is why I've always said, if people take personality tests, I wish that they were taken not just by me, but by people around me to varying degrees of closeness. I want like my family to take one, my girlfriend to take one, my best friends to take one, an enemy to take one, a close acquaintance to take one, someone I just met to take one. I want all these different people and all of their perceptions represented in a personality test, not because they should dictate who I am or how I'm perceived, but they do play a part in that. I also want to have some say in how I'm perceived, or what my personality is, how I perceive myself, but it's kind of a mix of all of those things. If I take a test and it says, are you kind and just and loving? And I'm like, "Oh, absolutely I am. I'm so fair-minded and I treat people well." But everybody else in the world is like, "No, this guy's horrible." Well, there's a dichotomy here that we need to figure out. Who gets to decide what reality is? I think it's just a mix of both. Not that we should live our lives according to how everybody perceives us. This would get really chaotic pretty quickly, but I do think it plays a part to hear how other people perceive you or what reputation you have based on other people's opinions. But with this in mind, we also cannot ignore the fact that we also need to let people speak for themselves and tell us about themselves with their words, with their actions, so that we can learn who they are, or at least who they think they are, and who they're trying to be, who they'd like to be. So through our interactions, we can gain different perceptions on these people, and hopefully we get a more accurate view of who they are over time as we allow them to speak for themselves. Well, some of these pitfalls that happen when we are introduced to new people and their reputation precedes them absolutely happens when we interact with and are introduced to God. His reputation absolutely precedes him, and we learn about him from other people. And so when they come and tell us information about him, we need to be careful, because we need to know, is this God speaking for himself and they're just delivering that information? God said this about himself. Or are they telling me something that is their perception of God, which might not be bad information, it might be true and right, but I need to discern that. Or is this bad information based on their perception, which might teach me something else about God, or something about the person delivering that information? All of this needs to come into our minds and be filtered through when people tell us about God. Because in reality, all people are flawed. And so when we hear about who God is and we learn about him, we're going to be getting information through a filter of a biased person. And we need to learn how to filter that bias just a little bit so that we know when we're learning about God in actuality versus when we're learning about him through someone's flawed bias. Maybe we find a harmful person in church that is in a position of power. They're supposed to be representing God. And so we look at their actions and we say, this person represents God. They're a horrible person. God must be horrible. Now, this could teach us something about God. Maybe it teaches us that sometimes God allows horrible people to find position, but it shouldn't teach us that God is horrible. So we need to be able to discern that information so we're not prejudging God. In the same way, skeptics and critics might attack God and tear him down in ways that play on our emotions. This shouldn't make us think, well, God must be that terrible because they say so, but it might teach us about this person and their experience with God or those who are associated with God, and it might also teach us something different about God, just something different than they're trying to deliver, namely that God has concepts about him that are difficult to understand and need wrestled with. But in amidst all these different perceptions on God, all this information we're getting from other people, wouldn't it also be good to let God speak for himself on who he is? If we do this, which we're going to do for the rest of the episode today, I think we're going to discover something pretty unusual about God, especially in light of every other God or so-called God that is believed to be in existence by the various world religions that exist currently or that have ever existed. So let's do this with the rest of our time. In the ancient world, to talk about God or a God was to talk about a powerful entity that most often had some sort of association with something. You have Baal or Baal, which is the storm god. There's Poseidon, who's the god of the sea. You've got Ra in Egypt, who is the sun god, but is also the sun. So that tells us something too, because often gods are associated with very different things, or they actually become those things themselves. Some gods, we see this often in the Bible, are gods of geographical regions. Daniel talks about the prince of Persia warring against angelic hosts, and this shows us that certain areas have certain gods or supernatural beings associated with them. But either way you look at it, each ancient god is kind of associated with a thing, an idea, or an event, or they become these things, ideas, or events themselves. For example, Pontus in ancient Greece was the god before Poseidon. He was a god of the sea, but when Poseidon kind of rose in popularity in their mythology, Pontus kind of took a back seat, and instead he became like this personification of the sea itself. So Pontus was the sea. In the same way in Egypt, the goddess Hapi wasn't just in charge of the flooding of the Nile, she actually was the flooding of the Nile. When the Nile flooded, they would say, Hapi is visiting us. She is with us right now. But the titles of these ancient gods often go the name, then it says God of the, then blank. But what's weird is that in the Bible, we get this exact same formula too. And this is where we can allow God to speak for himself, since we believe the Bible is the word of God from himself. But in Psalm 68:20, I'm just going to go through a brief list of these. In Psalm 68:20, God is the God of salvation. In Romans 15:33, he is the God of peace. Psalm 136:26, God of heaven. Mark 12:27, God of the living. Psalm 29 verse 3, God of glory. Romans 15:5, God of endurance and encouragement. And then this is where it starts to kind of escalate. These are already vast and important and very big topics that God says he is the God of, but this is where it starts to kind of start magnifying out from lowly all the way up to very, very high. Matthew 22:32 and also all throughout the rest of the Bible says that God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And many people are content to just say, okay, he's the God of them, but not of me. But in Jeremiah 31:1, it says he's also the God of all the clans of Israel. So it gets a little bit bigger. Ezra 7:19 says he's the God of Jerusalem, which was the capital of Israel. Jeremiah 28:2 makes it very final. He is the God of Israel, the God of that nation and that people, which also means those who wrestle with God, those who are faithful to God. And so this is not just a geographical thing, but it's also all who would be faithful to God. Romans 3:29 makes this point very clear. He is the God of the Jews and the God of the Gentiles. But Psalm 80 verse 7 ups the ante even more. He is the God of hosts. And Deuteronomy 10:17 says he is the God of gods. And Revelation 22:13, last one, he says, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, meaning he is the God throughout time, before time, and after time. So he is not one God amidst gods. He is the supreme God above everything and everybody else. But the fact that others want to equate him with various gods is very telling, because one of the favorite sayings of like atheists and skeptics is, oh, Christians are atheists too, just in respect to every god except for one. But this is a little deceptive, because to say that our God is like the millions of other gods in the ancient religions is absolutely misinformed and not allowing him to speak for himself. It can be informative, though, that others will misrepresent God as a lesser patron god, as you find in the ancient religions or other religious traditions of like paganism, because it shows us that we are not having the same conversation when we talk about God's power and his existence. It can be informative when others mistake God, our God, for one who's just over a certain people group or a certain geographical region, like the gods that are confined to geographical regions that we read about in the Bible. Because this shows us they don't understand that choosing to obey and follow anything less than our God is to ignore a greater reality. It can be informative when others act as if God lived a long time ago. He was a God of some ancient people way back when, and he had a power over them, but he kind of stayed in the past with those less informed, unenlightened people. That can be informative because it shows us they are not thinking big enough. Other people's perceptions about God can certainly be informative to us, probably more so about the people delivering those perceptions to us than about God himself. But we need to make sure that our view of God does not come only from those other people, but that we let God speak for himself as well. And when we do, we realize that those who believe that they have God boxed in are really the ones that have thought about him the least and probably have not thought nearly big enough about him.